Hello and welcome to the CVL podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we'll be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is the CVL podcast.
Before we dive in, I have some exciting news. The CVL podcast has a new name, Neurologic. We've got some amazing interviews lined up in the coming months, so stay tuned and help us spread the word.
In today's episode, we meet with Dr. Muireann Irish, a renowned cognitive neuropsychologist who is originally from Ireland, where she completed her undergraduate and postgraduate studies at Trinity College in Dublin. She then moved to the University of Sydney in Australia, where she's now an associate professor at the Brain and Mind Centre and the director of the Irish Lab, studying memory, motivation, apathy, and anhedonia in aging and in dementia. She's received numerous prestigious awards and is a strong advocate for women in science and has been named as one of Australia's superstars of STEM. Dr. Irish's research primarily focuses on the cognitive neuroscience of dementia, particularly the early detection of younger onset dementia and the mechanisms underlying these conditions. Her work aims to improve the early and accurate diagnosis of dementia and to uncover new treatment targets and raise awareness about living well with dementia. In this episode, we discuss how memory and imagination are changed during neurological conditions, including certain types of dementia. Dementia is an umbrella term describing a symptom, but there can be many types of dementia. In previous episodes, we've often discussed Alzheimer's disease, which is known for its effects on episodic memory, where people can't remember unique events like what they had for breakfast this morning or the conversation they had a few minutes ago. In this episode, we also talk about frontotemporal dementia, which also affects episodic memory, but comes with difficulties in language and changes in personality and behavior, such as acting more selfishly or more impulsively, and the memory symptoms tend to appear later in this type of dementia, which may delay diagnosis. We also discuss semantic dementia, which, as the name implies, affects our semantic knowledge or our general knowledge of the world. So knowing things like Paris is the capital of France, which is general knowledge which we know, but we don't remember when exactly we acquired that knowledge. So that can lead to difficulty in naming objects, even if we know what they are used for. So you would know how to use a fork, but you wouldn't know that it's called a fork. Or difficulty finding words during conversations. We discuss how the inability to imagine the future affects motivation and how this can take the joy out of anticipating future events. Dr. Irish explains how anhedonia, or the inability to experience pleasure, is a common symptom in many types of dementia, and how this may be due to the loss of motivation, as many of these patients are only able to live in the present moment. This may look like emotional withdrawal or apathy to those around these patients, but it's actually due to changes in the brain. We also chat about the importance of daydreaming and mind wandering and how these everyday brain activities fuel creativity and productivity, something that can be disrupted in dementia. And lastly, we dive into Dr. Irish's research on how we perceive time and how this changes as we age. It's a thought-provoking conversation that sheds light on how our brains shape the way we experience the world. So stay with us as we explore the fascinating world of memory, imagination, and dementia with Dr. Muireann Irish.
Dr. Irish, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get into learning about your research, could you tell us a bit about your background and your journey into cognitive neuroscience?
Sure. As my surname suggests, I actually am Irish. So I'm originally from a very small town in the southeast of Ireland called Wexford. I just went to the local primary school, the local secondary school. I think one of the things that sort of possibly set me off on this journey was the fact that my mum was a science teacher. So I was kind of brought up surrounded by, encyclopedias and like biology books and textbooks. And my dad was actually an art teacher and an artist. So it was like this really nice mix of science and art in our house. And I think I was just always very curious about different things, like how people tick, what motivates people's actions and why people would, behave in certain ways. But I didn't really have a clear career path at all when I was growing up. In fact, I wanted to be a ballerina when I was younger. So that didn't work out. But I had originally intended to study medicine at university and got into the medical program, but my mum reminded me that I'm squeamish, and she said I would have to deal with blood and fluids, and did I want to maybe rethink my choice? So I put psychology down and got into the psychology program, and just then spent the next, couple of years just really enjoying actually all aspects of that program, learning about the history of psychology, the philosophy, animal psychology. I found it all really, really interesting. But it was in a third year cognitive neuropsychology lecture that was given by Ian Robertson. And I distinctly remember even where I was sitting, like I knew exactly. It's like a very vivid episodic memory.
Yeah, I was going to say episodic memory right there. Great
totally.
Example.
I've got like the time, the place. I know exactly where I was sitting. I can remember seeing him, and he was talking about memory, and he was talking about HM, about memory dysfunction, the hippocampus. And I just remember thinking, this is what I want to do. This is me. This is like exactly what I want to be studying and looking at. And so I ended up then sort of honing in on that sort of area of cogneuro and doing my honours dissertation in Alzheimer's disease and memory. And it sort of just set me off on that path.
Nice. Very nice. That's very interesting. So what drew you specifically to memory research and what you're doing right now?
Yeah. So I think it was a combination of always being quite a good, source of memory as a child. So I used to have a very, very good memory, and I used to be called upon like by my parents and my siblings to kind of adjudicate, whose turn is it to do the ironing? Oh, ask Muireann, she'll remember who did it last week. I just seemed to remember a lot of detail, and I always used to find that quite interesting. And then as I was gravitating towards, learning and studying about memory in college, my grandmother actually began to show signs of Alzheimer's disease. And this was really, I think, a turning point for me. So it was very confronting to see someone that I had grown up very closely with who had a mind that was just profoundly sort of formidable. Her memory was incredible. And she really prided herself on her cognitive prowess. She was a midwife, and she used to be able to tell you the date, the birth weight, the delivery, the circumstances of all the people who she had delivered under her care in our town in Wexford. And so to see someone who was so, independent and like so solid and stable all through my life, then start to show signs of dementia, really impressed on me at quite a young age. I think I was only 17, that this was something I wanted to do something about. I wanted to understand what was happening to her. Why was this happening? Could we do anything to help her? And so when the opportunity arose in university to actually focus in on that topic, I chose that as my final year dissertation, and it kind of went from there.
Mm-hmm. So one of the areas that you focus on is semantic dementia. Could you explain what that is, and how is it different to other types of dementia that people are more familiar with, like Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so semantic dementia is one of these syndromes that I think I had only read about in passing, when I was in university. And then when I moved to Sydney, Australia, and started working in the Frontier Research Group, then I had this opportunity to actually work with these individuals who are living with semantic dementia. And so, as the name suggests, it's a neurodegenerative disorder. It typically strikes individuals who are under the age of 65. So it's a younger onset form of dementia, which makes it quite different from the classic sort of later or sporadic onset of Alzheimer's disease that we'd all be more familiar with. And so in semantic dementia, as the name kind of suggests, our patients will come into the clinic complaining for a loss of memory for words. But when we actually perform sort of cognitive testing and neuropsychological full workup with them, it transpires that they're actually showing a deterioration of their semantic knowledge or their conceptual knowledge base. So their understanding of the world and that rich sort of repository of knowledge that we all carry around with us is starting to sort of erode. And this can be hugely problematic because our patients will start to sort of not remember, faces, who people are, objects, comprehension of things that we all take for granted. And so it can make navigating the world really difficult. It becomes progressive because it is a neurodegenerative disorder. So eventually we'll start to see other impairments as the underlying pathology spreads in the brain. And it can be quite devastating for, these individuals because they are younger. These symptoms strike in middle age sometimes, and they're still at their peak sort of career, raising families, trying to care for parents sometimes. And so it can be very profoundly upsetting to see all of these changes happening in someone who's actually quite a bit younger than the classic dementia cases that we would typically think of.
Yeah.
So whereas in like Alzheimer's, it's more about episodic memory and not knowing, what happened this morning or what the conversation you had 10 minutes ago, it's more like you would not know what a fork is or a chair is. And although you'd know what to do with them, you wouldn't know what the words are for them.
Yeah,
right?
So it's a loss of meaning. It's a loss of comprehension. But episodic memory, and this is the really fascinating part, episodic memory is typically relatively intact. So for recent experiences, a person with semantic dementia will have a very good ability to retrieve. Now, their narratives may lack the nouns and the words that we use, but they can still walk you through, what they did yesterday or a seminal event that happened over the last year, for example. But if you start probing into more sort of conceptually driven forms of memory or going deeper into the past, where memories tend to be more semantic or semanticized, then we start to see a lot of difficulties. Spatial navigation is also remarkably intact in these patients. And so we can see, examples of patients navigating very well, but then maybe coming to a red light and not understanding what exactly that signifies. So it can be very problematic.
Right. So kind of one of the interesting things I read in your research that you do is that you found that individuals who have this semantic dementia, they have actually a difficulty imagining the future. So could you kind of talk more about what's going on there?
Yeah, so this was one of the sort of early studies that I did in my postdoctoral research in Sydney. And I had been, working with these patients and just trying to understand this really fascinating syndrome. And one of the areas that was becoming hugely informative at that time was this relationship between remembering the past and being able to envisage or imagine the future. And so there had been so many really elegant studies showing that the ability to imagine the future actually relies very heavily on the same neural machinery as autobiographical memory or the ability to remember the past. And I wondered in semantic dementia then, so they're able to remember the recent past in actually quite good detail. Would that sort of overcome their semantic difficulties, and would they still be able to envisage events in the future? And it turned out, surprisingly, they were as impaired as patients with Alzheimer's disease. So this was really quite a strong finding for us to show, because we demonstrated that even though they have this availability of recent experiences, it's not sufficient to enable them to envisage events in the future. And we showed that actually when we studied their brains using brain imaging, so structural brain imaging, we found that the degree of atrophy or brain volume loss in regions that are really important for semantic memory, these were the key areas that were sort of correlating or associated with their future thinking impairment. So we showed that you can have different clinical groups, so we can have Alzheimer's disease and semantic dementia, showing these difficulties in envisaging the future, but they're actually driven by different underlying mechanisms. And that was actually quite an important step forward for the field.
So what areas of the brain are involved in semantic dementia? I mean, with Alzheimer's, we talk a lot about the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe, and seeing atrophy there, and also about how those regions, specifically the hippocampus, is important for future thinking and for scene reconstruction and that kind of thing. So how does that translate to semantic dementia, and what areas are involved there?
Yeah, so this is what's, I think, really interesting about semantic dementia, is that in the initial or early stages of the disease, the atrophy or the changes in the grey matter are pretty confined to just a single area of the brain, so the anterior temporal lobes. And so we see that frontal regions, parietal regions, these are all actually relatively intact. And so for many years, it was assumed that the hippocampus was intact in semantic dementia because these patients were showing relatively, preserved recent episodic memory. But actually, we have done a number of studies showing that the hippocampus is actually more atrophied in semantic dementia compared to Alzheimer's disease. So again, this is really interesting because we're showing one group that has profound memory difficulties, so Alzheimer's disease, but we're showing this other patient group that has more hippocampal volume loss, but they actually can remember the recent past. So this has made me start to think, well, there must be other regions that are implicated. And so my hunch is that the parietal lobes are doing a lot of work and supporting memory function in semantic dementia, at least in the early stages.
So with semantic dementia, you said it's the anterior temporal lobe, so kind of in front of the hippocampus.
Yes, and then we see a lot of lateral temporal, anterior temporal, and it begins then to progress into the insula and then into orbitofrontal regions. So, but the parietal lobes remain relatively spared actually until very, very late in the disease course. So there's an interesting aspect of sort of preservation there that I think we need to pay more attention to.
So I kind of want to go back a little bit to the imagining the future aspect of these. And, these are disrupted in individuals with semantic dementia. So how does that affect their motivation to engage in life and, in future planning? Because if you can't imagine the future, how do you plan what's for dinner, for example? So how do the patients navigate that? Yeah,
so I think you've touched on such an important sort of clinical implication of these findings. And I think it's one that hadn't really been considered, up until recently. So if you think about the contents of your inner sort of dialogue or monologue that you have with yourself, a lot of the thoughts that we have every day are actually future oriented. So we're constantly thinking ahead. We're planning that next step. We're thinking about what we're going to say or do, from moment to moment and then across longer time scales. And the whole idea of us having this future oriented system is highly adaptive from like an evolutionary perspective. So it enables us to plan, to think, to troubleshoot, to have hypothetical scenarios play out and to consider alternatives. And then if you think about what it might be like to lose that capacity, it's dreadfully, disruptive and I think very poignant as well to not be able to think about what you might do next or what might occur in your future. So there's many different sort of aspects that I think we need to start considering in more depth here. The impact of that on motivation. Why would you be motivated to get up and go out if you don't actually have that clear scene or that clear image in your mind of what it is that's going to transpire? And also a sense of self. So if we can't think about ourselves as operating or, being sort of in the future, I think that's profoundly disruptive to your sense of self and your sense of continuity. And we are starting to really think about how does that impact behaviors and things like apathy or depression or even just this loss of motivation that we see in dementia. So I believe they are all very much tied together and that we actually need to do a better job of teasing apart what's happening.
I mean, that must really affect them in things like trying to find joy in life and staying motivated to engage in everyday activities when usually we're doing things to improve ourselves or we're planning a trip and we're excited about it. So they don't get to experience those types of emotions, I guess.
And it's really interesting when you do sort of give them a scenario. So if we say to them, okay, well, I want you to imagine that you're on, a sandy beach, and we'll sort of try and set the scene for them and almost construct the scene for them. Then we find that many of our patients can sort of draw on previous episodic experiences and sort of give you a good approximation of what it might be like, but they're really not connecting in deeply with that material. And so, as you've said, if you can't imagine the future, then it is I think, profoundly altering in terms of your ability to derive joy and pleasure from life. And so we have actually started a whole new line of research exploring this idea of anhedonia, which is the loss of pleasure. And it's something that's typically seen in major depressive disorder. But we demonstrated a few years ago for the first time that anhedonia is actually really striking in patients with semantic dementia and frontotemporal dementia. And so our participants are showing highly reduced levels of pleasure. They are unable to anticipate pleasure or joy, and they're also showing a reduction of pleasure in the moment during, that consumption of rewards, we would call it. So again, this is extremely upsetting to think about, that we have participants that are, really restricted in terms of their ability to imagine and also their ability to derive joy and pleasure in their daily lives. And I think it's also hugely upsetting for family members and carers of patients, because things that they used to do together and to bond over now seem to be, taken away. So it's a multi-pronged sort of problem, I think, that has gross implications.
So this anhedonia, the loss of pleasure, is it more severe in patients with semantic dementia versus like Alzheimer's patients?
Yeah. And so this is really interesting in that we found that anhedonia was not as prevalent or as striking in patients with Alzheimer's disease, whereas it was really a strong predictor of functional decline in semantic dementia. And it seems to be contributing to a host of other behavioral problems that we see in this syndrome, like behavioral rigidity or sort of seeking out rewarding experiences that are very different from things that they used to pursue prior to the onset of the disease. But what I think is really important for care is the fact that we found that in Alzheimer's disease, we see this sort of reduction in anticipatory pleasure, which would make sense because patients with Alzheimer's disease find it very difficult to envisage the future. But we see completely intact levels of consummatory pleasure. So if you present a person with Alzheimer's disease with something that's rewarding, such as music or art, food, they will still derive that same hit of pleasure from that experience. So it really suggests we have to think about, bringing the rewarding experiences to our patients and making sure that they're not neglected or expected to initiate these things themselves.
So because they can't kind of imagine getting pleasure from those types of situations, they wouldn't ever suggest, wanting to go out for a walk or do whatever it is. So
exactly.
You'd have to kind of suggest it to them.
So I think there's a real connection between our ability to anticipate and imagine these experiences and then our ability to initiate and carry out the steps that are required to get the reward. And I think if that first step of being able to envisage or anticipate is blocked, it will actually set up this whole vicious cycle where the person's unable to sort of execute or initiate the actions needed.
So how would that be different to the anhedonia you see, for example, in depression?
So in depression, the anhedonia can be very severe. And I think there have been a number of studies that show that that occurs in conjunction with this sort of negative affect, so this low mood. Whereas we don't actually see this negative affect in patients with frontotemporal dementia or semantic dementia. So it's more evidence that anhedonia seems to be this standalone feature where the loss of pleasure itself is grossly compromised. But when you ask patients to rate themselves on measures of depression or mood, they don't actually report feeling those same levels of low affect. So this to me is interesting from a sort of neurobiological perspective because it suggests there's probably different substrates or different regions of the brain that are responsible for these different symptoms. And maybe then there's a way that we could target and sort of improve some of these symptoms.
So it's almost like they don't know what they're missing. Whereas somebody with depression is like, I don't want to go on a walk because I don't feel good. The person with semantic dementia wouldn't know what it would feel like to go on a walk, so they would not suggest going.
I think as well, one of the things that we've been finding is that the nature of the experiences that our patients find as rewarding does change. And so we might have seen, an individual who used to really enjoy reading, but then the comprehension difficulties in semantic dementia can make that extremely difficult. We see this sort of redirection of reward and pleasure seeking onto sometimes quite unusual stimuli. So participants might start to show a preference for things that they never pursued previously. And this can be quite jarring then for family members to manage, because sometimes it may not be socially palatable, some of the things that they're interested in pursuing. So we have this sort of push-pull between, changes in, apathy and anhedonia towards things that used to be a source of bonding between the patient and the family members. And then the patient actually showing goal-directed behavior towards possibly unsavory or unusual rewarding experiences. And then the carers are trying to sort of manage these changes in the context of the other symptoms of dementia. So it's a really fraught landscape. And I think we've only started to kind of scratch the surface of understanding the full nature of these symptoms.
So I'd kind of like to switch gears to something else that you have looked at called theory of mind and how it's affected in semantic dementia. So can you break that down for us? What is theory of mind and how is it related to semantic dementia?
Yeah, so theory of mind is actually a sort of a concept that came from the developmental literature. So it's very much studied in children's ability to understand and comprehend the world. And we see that it's compromised in children with autism. So theory of mind is that ability to almost mind read, to understand that other people have, mental abilities and thoughts, feelings and wishes that are distinct from your own. And also to be able to sort of step in their shoes and consider, well, what might they be thinking and what might they be needing, as opposed to what you, the person yourself, would feel or think in a certain scenario. So it enables us to almost perspective take, to turn take, and to anticipate and consider the needs of other people and the feelings and thoughts of other people. And that in itself is hugely important for successful social interactions. So if we can understand what other people are thinking, we can sort of anticipate what they might need, we can respond accordingly, and we can either, circumvent arguments, or we can comfort people, we can show empathy. All of these really higher level social capacities are really important. So it hadn't really been studied actually in the context of semantic dementia. And once we had done the initial studies on future thinking, I started thinking about, well, if patients are unable to envisage the future and they seem to be really relying on their recent experiences, it suggests an inability to think of alternatives to what they've already experienced. So I wondered, well, another type of alternative is someone's perspective. It's like thinking of something that's distinct from your own field of view or your own perspective. So we did a very sort of simple, but quite a nice study where we used cartoons that were free from sort of verbal demands or semantic kind of demands. And so some of the cartoons were just sort of physical humor kind of scenarios where you just describe what you see. Some of the jokes in the cartoons needed a sort of theory of mind to understand why the joke was funny. So one of these examples is there's a hunter in the woods and there's a bear behind him, and the joke is that the bear is about to hunt the hunter. So you need to be able to understand from the hunter's perspective that the bear is behind. You need to understand the joke from the bear's perspective that he's going to get revenge. And so interestingly, our patients with semantic dementia did quite well on the physical cartoons, but showed a very selective deficit on those theory of mind cartoons. So there's something about being able to consider that there are different perspectives at play that they struggle with. And what was really interesting was when we looked using structural neuroimaging, we found that it was atrophy or grey matter volume changes in the right anterior temporal lobe, which predicted these theory of mind impairments. So typically in semantic dementia, the atrophy commences on the left-hand side. So now we're seeing that as it progresses and moves across into the other hemisphere, we start to see these social cognitive changes, which I think is really interesting.
So this is typically like a later symptom, or as semantic dementia progresses later on, you see this theory of mind effect.
Yeah, it becomes
happening.
more prominent. Yeah.
So are there genetic risk factors for developing semantic dementia, like for Alzheimer's disease? We hear about the APOE gene, which is implicated there. Are there any specific genes or risk factors that are implicated in semantic dementia that we know about?
So at the moment, we don't know of any sort of causative gene in that sense in relation to semantic dementia. There are some pathologies that seem to be much more strongly associated with it, but these are only identifiable post-mortem. So we don't really have the capacity as yet to say who might be at risk for semantic dementia, which in itself is very problematic. That said, there are teams all over the world that are, developing new blood-based biomarkers and new tests to try and, improve the early detection of semantic dementia. But as yet, I think, to my knowledge, there are no genetic risk factors yet that we know of.
Okay. So one of the other things you looked at that I found really fascinating was mind wandering and daydreaming, which most of us probably don't think of as very consequential. We kind of spend most of our time trying to not do that. But you looked into it and looked into those with dementia. What did you find? What was the link there?
Yeah, so I think, as you've said, I think mind wandering gets a really bad rep. So we're constantly told, as children to pay attention, focus, tune out the distractions. But there's so much research out there to suggest that letting your mind go or letting your mind wander under the right circumstances, of course, is actually highly beneficial. And it's one of the ways in which we plan, we think ahead, we engage in theory of mind. We might work through what's happened during our day. We arrive at, creative solutions to problems. So many of my study ideas have come to me when I'm in the shower. It's these moments where you just kind of let yourself go and you let ideas just sort of work their way around and incubate. And so I think mind wandering in the right circumstances is hugely beneficial. So we need to just be careful about not telling everyone to not mind wander. So one of the things that we were interested in this study in dementia was kind of informed from that care perspective. So obviously with my grandmother, I spent a lot of time in nursing homes and residential aged care. And I used to wonder about, you see these individuals sitting sort of idle with nothing to do. And sometimes you might hear the refrain, oh, it's fine. They're just in their own thoughts, this kind of dismissive maybe attitude. And that stayed with me. And I kind of wanted to know, when someone is not otherwise stimulated by the external environment, what are they thinking about? Where are they going? What's happening in that internal sort of monologue? So we developed this very simple study where people are just viewing shapes on a screen. It's not cognitively demanding at all. Even as you're running the test, it's very tricky to stay focused on the participant because you just start drifting off. A healthy participant will see one of these shapes and will, you ask them, well, what were you thinking about right then? So a healthy participant will say, oh, well, I saw the green triangle. Then I started thinking of green, it reminded me of when I went to Ireland. And then suddenly they're off on this episodic, rich kind of journey through their thoughts and memories. Patients with frontotemporal dementia, this is another form of younger onset dementia, actually stayed very much bound to the stimulus in front of them. So a yellow circle or the green diamond, they would say, it's a green diamond. I like green.
Okay, so they're not really thinking much or like letting their mind wander to other areas.
Exactly. And even when we tried to probe them and to sort of push them along a little bit and say, is there anything else that you were thinking of? Other sensations? No, it's a green diamond. So we also explored the neural correlates of this capacity. We called it stimulus-bound thinking. And we found that it was strongly associated with atrophy in the hippocampus, in the striatum, and in the insula. And so these are all regions that are implicated in memory, in toggling between your internal and external environments, and in motivation. So the striatum is very important for motivation. And for me, on a sort of a clinical or personal level, I found it really upsetting to think that you are trapped almost by what's in your immediate surroundings, because we kind of don't really view mind wandering as a luxury, but it is. So if you're in a very boring or a non-stimulating environment, you can take yourself out of there and you can daydream and you can think of other things. Whereas for some of these participants, they're really heavily bound to their current circumstances. And so if you were in a care setting that's not providing adequate stimulation, that could be very isolating. And I find that really kind of upsetting to think about people being locked in that kind of situation. So we need to I think make it clearer that just because someone is sitting and not engaging with their external surroundings doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't try and engage them, or we shouldn't approach them and offer them, activities or some form of stimulation.
Yeah. I think that has such important implications for caregivers. Instead of just letting the patient sit there, making sure, like you said, to have efficient stimulation going on there.
Yeah, and also maybe not taking it personally if the person they're caring for is not showing interest in what they're trying to get them to do, or maybe showing some apathy.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a classic sort of response that we do hear from caregivers and from family members. This lack of interest and this apparent indifference is hugely upsetting for family members. So, but it's organically driven. It's driven by changes in the brain. So it's not that the individual dementia is being defiant or oppositional. It's just the circuits that are driving motivated behavior are highly dysregulated. And so I genuinely think that when a dementia diagnosis is given, there should be therapy and support given for the family as well, because it's a very difficult thing to navigate.
Especially when we're talking about these like early onset dementia, semantic dementia patients who can have symptoms appear at 40, 50. I mean, this is a lot of times when individuals are raising families, their careers flourishing. So I can see how much that can affect individuals around them and their social circle. Even more so than, elderly and when you're getting older and in the retired stages. Yeah.
And I feel there's often an element of, a life being sort of cut short when they were in their prime. A lot of resources are now being developed to help children of people with dementia understand and navigate, because some of these children are, trying to do exams in school, and it's, a hugely fraught period for them anyway. So there is greater awareness now, I think, and there are more resources being promoted, but I think we could do a lot better.
So the study that you mentioned just now, where you were looking at mind wandering, you were looking at frontotemporal dementia. So what exactly is that? It's another younger onset dementia, as you mentioned, but what is the difference between that and semantic dementia or Alzheimer's?
So in frontotemporal dementia, as you said, it is a younger onset form of dementia, and it's kind of the umbrella term for a number of different syndromes. So the subtype of frontotemporal dementia that we were looking at in that study was the behavioral variant. And this is a syndrome that's characterized by a prefrontal and medial frontal atrophy. So these are the regions that are the most recent in terms of evolution. And so they control the sort of higher order functions like theory of mind, like impulse control, and being able to show empathy and plan, all of these really higher order sophisticated functions. And so in the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, we see the pathology typically starts in the frontal lobes. So there can be changes in personality, in behavior. There's difficulties with planning and sequencing and executive control. And it can make for quite impulsive and inappropriate behaviors that are completely at odds with the person's pre-morbid personality. And this can be extremely difficult for families, because you're seeing someone who might have been very, committed, very responsible, suddenly gambling or blowing the family's savings, or making kind of impulsive decisions, maybe getting arrested. And there are this whole constellation of different features that all start to happen as the frontal lobes are compromised. And so it's a different form of younger onset dementia, but it has just as kind of striking and difficult consequences.
It must be quite jarring, because you probably before diagnosis are just going through these personality changes, and everyone around you is probably wondering what's wrong with you. They're not going to, the first thing they're going to think is not going to be dementia, right?
Maybe like a midlife crisis.
Exactly. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges, is that we really do see a long lag time between the carer's report of that first symptom or that first sort of hunch that something wasn't right. Up to the point of diagnosis, they may have seen numerous GPs. They may have been referred to a psychiatrist. They may have been put onto antidepressants or suspected of having maybe schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And so dementia is not the first thing that people typically think of, because it's still not part of our, I guess, vernacular when we think about these changes in middle age. And so it can be never mind how difficult the changes are themselves, it's like trying to fight to get that diagnosis. By the time we see patients in our clinic, most of the carers will report a feeling of relief that now they actually have a label, they have something they can work towards, and they can actually, join other support groups and find out more about these diseases. But I think they're in the wilderness for quite a long time. So the time it takes to diagnose frontotemporal dementia is almost double that than Alzheimer's disease, because just this lack of awareness.
Yeah, because I think with Alzheimer's, when you see those, or even with somatic dementia, when you see memory changes, people don't assign that or attribute that to personality. They think, there's something wrong in the neurobiology of your brain. Whereas with personality, they see it as a choice almost, right? That you're choosing to be difficult or
maybe it's a sign that the marriage is not working out or you're under stress and there's all these competing demands in midlife. And I think a lot of the time there is this tendency to refer to psychiatry and then people are placed on inappropriate medication schedules. So it's a sort of a battle, I think, for the families to get the symptoms recognized. And a lot of the time we do see, dissolution of marriage. We do see families breaking up, and it's only further down the track that it becomes apparent this was actually a neurodegenerative disorder. So it's very sad.
Yeah. So how is it diagnosed initially? Is it just through neuropsychological testing?
So we, in the Frontier Clinic, we would have a neurologist who would do a full workup. We take bloods. We also do a structural MRI. And I think that is one of the crucial things. So you can actually localize then the atrophy and see where is affected in the brain. But I think what's really crucial in all of this is, on top of the neuropsychology testing, on top of the neurology, the scans, is the carer report and the family report. And that is always really revealing. That's when you start to hear about the little subtle changes, the things that have been sort of niggling at them, but they just weren't sure. It was just a feeling that something was off. Yeah. And then it all becomes corroborated throughout that sort of workup. So
is this something that the individual can be aware of themselves, like with Alzheimer's, the kind of preclinical type of dementia you get, or the initial kind of stages are mild cognitive impairment, and before that there's even subjective cognitive impairment, where people have some sense that their memory isn't what it was, but they can kind of compensate for it and not let the outside world know, but they are aware of it internally. Is there any awareness in frontotemporal dementia? So in the behavioural variant of FTD, we typically do see this loss of insight. And so by the time we see a person presenting at our clinic, we can ask them many questions about, you've lost your job, things aren't looking so good in terms of financial situation. And even when the clinician will outline the various problems to the person and then ask them, well, how do you feel? We'll typically see this sort of indifference, like, yeah, I feel great, I feel fine, I don't know why I'm here, everything is good. So because these medial regions in the front of the brain are being compromised by the pathology, that can contribute to this idea of a loss of insight. So a lack of being able to reflect on your capacities and to also compare them to how you were pre-morbidly. So it can be very challenging for family members when you have someone who's acting quite, differently to how they were pre-onset of the dementia, but also who don't seem to have an awareness that anything is wrong. That can make caring very, very difficult.
So you mentioned pathology. So I was going to ask, with Alzheimer's disease, we have specific pathologies that we look for. PET scans can pick these up. Now we have blood biomarkers that look for what's called amyloid or tau. Is there a similar pathology in semantic dementia?
So in semantic dementia, we do see this, it's called TDP43 type C, and that seems to be the one that is most strongly associated with having the clinical phenotype of semantic dementia in life. So these are typically picked up post-mortem. As yet, we don't have any accurate sort of blood biomarkers that can screen for these changes in the clinic. But I think this is something that's actually being worked on as we speak. So I'm hopeful that we may have some kind of biomarkers that we could use in the clinic. But ultimately, with semantic dementia, the language changes are so profound. It's very, once you see the patient in front of you, semantic dementia is is quite straightforward to diagnose, often on the basis of semantic naming comprehension. And then if you have a structural MRI, that can nearly be enough.
So another thing that I was very fascinated with was your work on the perception of time and how that changes as we age. I mean, I feel like we get so busy as we get older that maybe it's something to do with that, but are there other things involved?
Yeah, so I mean, this is just a sort of a pet project that I'm quite interested in, just as we're all getting older. But I think one of the interesting things is the relationship between time perception and memory. And so there are a few theories out there, but the sort of predominant one is that as we get older, there are less sort of defining or landmark kind of changes that we're experiencing compared to when we were younger. So we've probably all heard about the reminiscence bump of autobiographical memory. So this is in our early adulthood. It's a period of intense change. So we're experiencing all these firsts, like our first job, passing your driving test, your first kiss, getting married, having children. And these are really important life events that contribute to our sense of self. And it sort of stays with us and gives us that continuity across the lifespan. But as we get older, we're moving further and further away from the firsts. And so it can seem as though time has actually been speeding up because there's a longer period since that initial set of firsts or those formative kind of experiences. And so it's been suggested that memory gives us these little landmarks. And so the more that we can dot in, the less expansive time will feel. So this is all a perception. This is not that time is moving more quickly. It's more that it just feels that way. And so one of the really interesting things about all of this is that if we look at COVID, this is like a natural experiment where we all got sort of severed from our usual experiences. So during those couple of years, we had very few defining experiences that would punctuate our timeline. And so the days felt very, very long, but actually time felt like it was going very quickly because we really didn't have much in that time to sort of stamp it out and to break up the timeline. So it's interesting that memory can serve almost as an anchor, and that can make it feel like time is passing more slowly. And then if you don't have those anchor points, it can feel as though time has gone by very quickly.
So there's increasing recognition that dementia can manifest differently in men and women. Have you noticed any gender-specific patterns in your research, especially in younger onset dementia?
Yeah, so I think this is territory that's only starting to be explored in the context of younger onset dementia. And so colleagues of mine have started to look to see, are there gender differences in terms of behaviors and changes in behavior. The interesting thing and sort of a caveat that we need to think about is that with the diagnosis of younger onset dementia, we rely a lot on the carers. So the perspective of the nature of those changes is going to depend on the gender, which typically is the opposite. If we have a husband coming in with behavioral changes, more often we might have a spouse or a child. Typically the daughter or the wife will come and report. So it's really, I think, hinges on who the person was pre-morbidly, who is reporting on the changes as well, and also this kind of social interpretation of what's appropriate, according to gender, traditional sort of gender stereotypes. So if a patient, a woman starts acting more impulsive or more, outwardly demonstrative, that might be seen as a change. But if a woman becomes more apathetic, it may be seen as more socially acceptable. And this is just in general. So I think there are a lot of problems in how we interpret these changes in behavior based on the person, the context in which they're living in, and also there may be cross-cultural differences too in terms of what's deemed acceptable and appropriate across different, cultures and socioeconomic groups.
So I also know that you're a very big advocate for women in science. So could you tell us why that's important and how you've worked to promote it?
Yeah, so I think I sort of stumbled into the advocacy from a kind of naive place. So I think growing up in Ireland, I had a very different upbringing, I think, compared to a lot of my peers. So my dad was actually a very strong feminist. And so the chores in the house were always divided evenly. He was very strong on me as the only girl, doing my absolute best, living up to my potential. He always would sort of say if I wanted to do something, I would do it. And that's, when I go out in the world and I see what other people, what their experiences are, I realize not everyone had that experience. Not everyone has had a strong male promoter and a male sponsor kind of telling them they can do anything. And so as I started, becoming a bit more successful in my career, I really felt like I wanted to show that the idea of a scientist is not this traditional stereotype of, old Einstein with crazy hair and a white lab coat. Like, that's just not realistic. I also found becoming a mother really impressed on me the need to show my two sons in particular that women can actually be, out there doing something really important and also being caregivers and providers. So you don't have to compromise on the two roles. And unfortunately, I've seen many people think that they can either pursue the academic career and sacrifice having a family, that it's a choice. We were part of this really impressive initiative, the Athena Swan. So it's called Science in Australia, Gender Equity, SAGE. And so one of the things about working in this task group was they showed us the leaky pipeline of women in science. And this is the scissor chart that many people will be familiar with, where you see at a certain point, men and women are equally represented doing PhDs. And all of a sudden, the line starts to change and women start to literally fall out of the system. And that to me was quite horrifying, especially when I took my first period of maternity leave. And I kept saying to myself, I will not be a statistic. I will do this. Like, I'm not falling out of the system. And it's really hard, and it shouldn't be that hard. And I think that's why I was quite motivated to sort of go into schools and show young girls, look, I'm a professor. Like, I don't have crazy white hair and I'm not wearing a lab coat, and I have two little boys at home and we're making this work. I didn't go to a fancy school. I'm not from an affluent area. I'm just doing something that I'm really passionate about and that I'm good at and I really enjoy. And so I'm just trying to maybe break down a bit of that ivory tower and show that if you do find your niche and if you do find your passion, I think with the right support, you can do it. It's not always easy, but there's plenty of male and female mentors and sponsors out there who do want to help. And I think, we should all be trying to be a bit more open about, like, there's a place for everyone in science. And if we exclude minorities, if we exclude women, it just doesn't make for as rich a discourse. We're losing ideas. And really, that's not something that I want to be part of. So
No, that's so important, so relevant. I think that a lot of scientists feel that way, but not a lot of people are good at communicating that, understanding what you were saying, that women belong and, you don't have to sacrifice career or family. You can do both. People just don't talk about it much, I feel like, in academia.
And I think it's surprising that even now, like with younger generations, I see that they still seem to view
have
it
that,
as
they still have it. Yeah, exactly like my generation. It's still either career, you pursue your science degree, or you stop, you get a family, and then try to get back into it. It's still very common thinking pattern, I think.
Yeah, and that makes me really sad because I think, it's not easy. I'm not going to pretend that like it's all roses, but it is doable. And I still think if you were in any other profession where you're striving to be at the top, or as best you can be, and you have children, it's still going to be difficult. So I think it's more just, I guess, being transparent about these things and creating networks and support and kind of peer support so that, you can know what you're doing when you do decide to have a family, if that's what you want to do. The other thing that I really enjoyed doing was showing up at places heavily pregnant and giving talks about women in science, and people would be like, wow. And I'm like, it's possible. Exactly. It's the most natural thing in the world, and we can do it. Like, I think it's just more showing
and normalizing
it. Absolutely.
For sure.
True.
That's amazing. And thank you for being an advocate for women and doing that work. Thank you again for being on our podcast and for the work that you do in better understanding semantic dementia and frontotemporal dementia. Where can our listeners learn more about your work?
So we are currently constructing our new lab website, which I hope will be up and running soon. Otherwise, any of the you could search for me on PubMed or on the University of Sydney Faculty of Science web pages.
All right, Dr. Irish, thank you again so much for being on our podcast and for having a conversation with us today. And we're excited to continue following your research.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Soumya Sambamurthy and Josh Olivier for editing this episode. To learn more about the Centre for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research, as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.